Welcome to Table Bible Studies with Den and Ben. Today we begin a wonderful series discussing the Bible book of Ruth. Dennis and Benedicta will introduce one of the most loved biblical accounts of an unusual daughter-in-law. Be sure to plan to join us every Thursday as we post a new episode of Table Bible Studies with Den and Ben.
So we are beginning one of your favorite books as we study it, and that is the book of
Ruth.
The book of Ruth. Why is it women love the book of Ruth so much?
Because so many of us women, the story of Ruth resonates with us. We love it, and especially my story, of us meeting and getting married is kind of a little similar to, Ruth and Boaz. And the story of Ruth is. The story of Ruth is a very interesting book, and it has a whole lot of information about it and what, ministry-wise, calling of God and the direction of God and how God brought these two people together to create one generation that led to Jesus is one other thing that makes everybody, love the book. Maybe not everybody, but at least some people love the book. And the book of Ruth is really interesting and talks much, about women, and Ruth is, somebody who somebody can just study and get something you can share with other women, and or even your life story. Like my life story, with match exactly like Ruth and Naomi and the Boaz. So I love it. I have preached it all around, the world, where, kind of from Africa to India and Philippines and all of that. So the book of Ruth is like one of my favorite books in the Bible. Yay!
All right. Well, and you're not alone. There's a lot of people love Ruth, both men and women. I think women tend to love it more, but men find it interesting as well, for sure. And let's just go ahead and start with the verse, and we kind of will put this into historical context. Notice that Ruth comes after just some of the first books of the Old Testament. You've got Genesis through Deuteronomy, which is called the Torah, the first five. Right. Then you've got Joshua and Judges, and then bang, here comes Ruth. So it's an indicator that this is an early time period. This isn't the time of David. In fact, David is going to be Ruth's great-grandson. I don't know if she lived to see him or not. But it says at the beginning, it came to pass in the days when the judges ruled that there was a famine in the land. And a certain man of Bethlehem, Judah, went to dwell in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his two sons. His name was Elimelech. His wife's name was Naomi. She plays a major role in this story. They have two sons, Mahlon and Chilion. They play minor roles because they're going to die pretty early. And it calls them Ephrathites of Bethlehem, Judah. So they go to Moab. Now, we stop right there for a moment. Boaz, we find out from the genealogy in, I think it's it would be in Matthew, that his mother was Rahab, and most scholars believe Rahab was the harlot that helped the two spies from Israel when they were just coming into the land to check it out. Yeah. When Joshua was about to begin the process of conquering the land of Canaan. Okay. So if Boaz's mother, number one, pretty amazing, this harlot ended up getting married and producing a wealthy, pretty important individual named Boaz. So it shows you what God can do with people with even the messiest background, right?
Right. I was like thinking, what we call common, or what we call what we reject, renounce it, that everybody is pointing accusing finger at, sometimes can be an instrument in the hand of God himself. So this story is the way you're narrating it right now. God using a harlot to bring up generation to come that is leading to something interesting. It's really remarkable.
Yeah, it really is. And what that means is, historically, this is at the very beginning of the time when the judges ruled. Now, there was no king. Saul was the first king. David was the second, who, as I mentioned, was the great-grandson of Ruth.
Yes.
But at this time, there was no king. And basically, you had these leaders that would rise up and kind of lead Israel or lead a portion of Israel. So that's what's going on right now. It was a wild time in the history of Israel. In fact, it was hardly a nation. There was no capital city. It was a bunch of tribes that are still trying to conquer the land, more or less. And in the midst of all this, you have this family. The husband's name was Elimelech. His wife was Naomi. They have a couple of sons. And then they do something that most people feel they should never have done. Although if they hadn't done it, this story wouldn't be here.
Wouldn't have been complete.
But what they did was, there was a famine, and they leave Israel and go to Moab. Now, Moab was a country that was considered a pagan country. They were idol worshipers. They were ungodly. They were not part of the covenant of Israel and God. So they're going to a foreign land where they're going to live and try to wait out the famine that was going on in Israel. Not all of Israel did that. Most of Israel did not leave and go to Moab. Most of Israel hung it out and toughed it out and made it through, and everything was fine. And as it's going to turn out, the husband's going to die, the two sons are going to die, and the wife, Naomi, is going to find herself without a husband, without sons, and basically in a destitute situation. And almost certainly she's going to regret going to Moab, going to this foreign country.
Yeah.
I was reading the commentator Matthew Henry, godly man who lived back in the 1700s, and he made the statement that so often when we are unstable and we don't have the right faith, we'll let tough times push us into just dropping out from where God has planted us and going into other situations. They basically dropped out of Israel. It's like, enough of this. We're out of here. We're going to go to Moab. Whether it was Naomi's idea or Elimelech's, probably Elimelech. Men pretty much rule the household in those days. But one way or the other, they decide to go. They take their two sons. So it says, Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, apparently not too long after they got to Moab. The sons take wives from the women of Moab. One was called Orpah, the other called Ruth. Now, these are Moabite ladies. So we see one likely mistake that was made that really they shouldn't have done, which is leave Israel to go to a foreign country.
Yeah.
Then number two, the two sons marry basically pagan women, idol-worshiping women that are not part of the covenant. They don't know the God of Israel, and that was strictly forbidden. It was, you would say, the way we would put it, it's against the law. You do not marry from the surrounding countries and idol worshipers. You marry within Israel. Now, the question is, why would they marry Moabitess women?
What I'm thinking right now would be, they went there with these, two sons of theirs.
Yeah.
And maybe the time they left Israel, they were not grown enough to get married.
Right.
If not, they would have married in the land of Israel before going.
Taking a couple of Israeli wives.
Along with them.
I think that's exactly right.
Uh-huh.
If we had a couple of unmarried sons and we moved to China,
right,
and they grew up in China, who are they going to marry but Chinese ladies?
Right.
Or if they grow up in Kenya, who are they going to marry but Kenya women? In other words, that's all that was available.
That was all they saw growing up. And, when they are growing up, every hormone in them is growing up.
Right.
And then, they are looking around, seeing these pretty ladies around.
Yeah.
So I think that was really, they're like, Mom, we are grown enough to get married. Dad, I think we're going to get married. We got girlfriends going. And they have them as girlfriends. Before you know it, they are really going, visiting them, talking to them, and the love is growing, amongst them. And before you know it, they want to get married. who else are they going to get married to, like you
Exactly.
said? The Moabites.
They didn't have Zoom meetings where they could go back and talk to Israeli girls, through Zoom or call them on the cell phone. So that's all that's available. That's who they end up marrying. Now, I think there's a point to be made with this, and that is they were put in a situation where it was almost certain they would marry Moabite women. You take a couple of young guys and they reach adulthood, they're going to want to get married. They're going to want ladies of their own.
Yes.
And if the only choice is Moabites, that's what they'll go for.
Yes.
So by leaving Israel and going to the land of Moab, a land of idol worshipers, an ungodly nation, they didn't know the true God, they essentially ensured their sons would marry women that didn't have God, women that didn't worship the true God, idol worshiping women. They guaranteed, it was almost a lock. It was a guarantee that their sons were going to marry Moabite women because they take them there and they reach adulthood. They've got to get married. That's all there is. Bam. So not only was it wrong in the sense that they weren't supposed to be living there in the first place, but it pushed their sons, it forced their sons into marrying ungodly women. Now, God is so amazing. He can sometimes take all our mistakes and make them turn around for good. And he's going to do that with Ruth. So it's not that it's not going to have a pretty happy ending in a lot of senses, but still, you have to acknowledge they made some pretty big mistakes. They should have stayed in Israel and let their boys marry Israeli women. That would have been the normal thing.
And another thing I'm thinking is like they would have, when the boys were up to the age of marriage, they would have been like, okay, the husband, can you take a trip to Israel and stay maybe 1 week or two and let the boys look around?
Yeah, or just send daddy to bring back a couple Israeli women. In those days, sometimes they did that, arranged marriage. I'll take you, and here's the dowry to the parents, and bam, here you go.
Even while they were, growing up, they must have had one or two girlfriends. They would be like, by now.
We don't know the age they were when they left. So
that's another thing.
We just don't know that.
Yeah.
But I think another point that needs to be made, Jesus said when he gave us what we call the Lord's Prayer,
right.
He said we're to pray, lead us not into temptation, deliver us from evil. When they brought their boys to Moab and they grew up in Moab, they were being brought in a place where they were surely going to do that. They were going to marry.
They led them into temptation?
They led their own sons into temptation, and they yielded. They married women that they had no business marrying. Like I said, God turned it around. It worked out okay for Ruth, but for Naomi, she paid a big price for those mistakes they made. She lost a husband. She lost her two sons. And so she didn't come out scot-free on this deal. We call it scot-free. She didn't come out without some suffering.
Yeah.
She's a widow, and she never remarries, as far as we know. She never has any more children, so she's without children. Her husband's dead. It works out okay financially. Ruth ends up meeting Boaz and all of that. But for Naomi, she paid a big price.
She went
for
through
that,
a lot.
For going to Moab.
She went through a lot.
She went through a lot. So it says in verse 5, the two sons, Mahlon and Chilion, died. The woman survived her two sons and her husband.
Probably most of you know my wife Benedicta, but few of you know the amazing paths God has led her to bring her to where she is today. Benedicta was orphaned at an early age and lived with an elderly stepmother growing to adolescence. They were so poor, Benedicta had to drop out of school and sell food door to door for them to survive. As a teen, Benedicta got a job as a housemaid, which developed into a nightmare. She was required to cook, clean, wash, take care of the children, and she had to get up at 4 a.m. every day just to get her work started. Worse than that, she was frequently beaten. At around 20, she moved to the huge city of Lagos, where she started her own little business. Sometimes she prospered, but at other times she nearly starved and went days at a time without eating. At one point, she became so sick she passed out in her room and nearly died. She found herself outside of her body, and she was able to see the splendors of heaven until she was sent back with a command to share her story. One day, however, her life changed when an American evangelist came to her community to preach, and of course, that was me. The rest, as they say, is history. Benedicta has shared her life story in a recently published autobiography, and you can get it on Amazon as either an ebook or a paperback. A link to this book on Amazon is in the description.